Hey, so this video is about Nagorno-Karabagh. If you're already familiar with the whole situation, Azerbaijani President Aliyev, his invasion in 2020 that turned into a blockade and now a genocide, and you just want to jump to the hot take that I promised, here's the timestamp, and I'll see you there. And for people who are not yet familiar with the whole thing, and probably still a little confused because I usually talk about coffee and cars on this channel, so what's this all about? Well, strap yourself in. You might have stumbled upon something that you didn't expect, a story about a really cruel man who's doing some pretty bad things and nobody seems to be willing to stop him. So the area we're talking about is Nagorno-Karabagh, also known as Artsakh, and it's a small cluster of villages in a mountainous area and really only one town at this point, in between the countries of Armenia and Azerbaijan. And it's never really been an important place on like a global scale, but for Armenians and Azeris alike, it's been very important. For Armenians, it's essentially the birthplace of their ancient civilization, with religious and cultural sites that go back more than 3,000 years. And Armenians have lived there continuously since that time, even though the population has dwindled for reasons that we'll talk about. Immediately prior to the issue that we're about to talk about, there were estimates of 120,000 ethnic Armenians living there, 30,000 of whom were children. And for Azeris as well, it's an important region for a number of reasons. The broader region, especially surrounding, has been home for some Azeris, significant numbers of Azeris in the last century or so. But for President Aliyev, it's important for a completely different reason. It's because ever since Azerbaijan became a country, not all that long ago, he has believed that their national identity must be defined as distinct from the other countries in the region, and it should be more closely linked to Turkey, which is a nation he very much admires, and controlling Nagorno-Karabagh is just one part of the end game of fabricating a oneness and a deeper brotherhood with Turkey. So please consider watching the other two videos for the history. I really don't want to come off as glossing over the Soviet involvement in manufacturing this conflict from scratch, really, and the truly bitter first war in 2020. And I talk there about how multiple ethnicities have lived over the years in many parts of modern day Armenia and modern day Azerbaijan, and how the genocide of 1915 condensed the Armenians in far less and less land. And now there remains this one party in Ilham Aliyev who doesn't want to share even what's left. So in those videos, I made the case for how the president of Azerbaijan, Ilham Aliyev, was in the process of starting a genocide by invading Artsakh in 2020. And I started by presenting one relatively generous interpretation of his invasion, that it was illegal and it was counter to the OSCE Minsk group process that was in place to resolve the territory's status. And his invasion was born out of a real Azeri frustration for how long the process was taking. And in and of itself, it didn't automatically mean it's genocidal. But then I went on to explain how circumstantially, there were these 3 points, the reasons why I felt that it wasn't genocidal. I went into detail in the other video. Suffice it to say that my take was not exactly what the mainstream media was repeating. It was my view that Aliyev was already a genocidal maniac then, and I was willing to wear that even though I risked looking like a bit of an alarmist. It might have still been plausible that there would be peace because the dust had not yet settled. With the Azeris having their buffer zone back, there would be a path to peace. So that didn't happen. When the 44-day war, as it was known, ended, Aliyev had captured all of the regions surrounding Artsakh proper, and then some, actually, and somehow major escalation into Armenia and Azerbaijan had been avoided, and the Russian peacekeepers were going to try to keep things under control. But in 2022, Aliyev was handed a gift in Vladimir Putin's invasion of the Ukraine. And from then on, fairly quickly, Russia's willingness and capacity to fulfill its role as peacekeeper was diminishing. And the European Union wanted to find a way to no longer purchase natural gas from Russia while still meeting all of its energy needs. So in her desperation, Ursula von der Leyen, president of the European Commission, ignored the cruelty and human rights abuses of Ilham Aliyev and decided autocratic Azerbaijan, with its state-owned energy company, would be Europe's alternate energy partner, despite much of the energy purchased through Azerbaijan being Russian gas anyway. And this was clearly a non-ethical move that should have been met with a lot of condemnation back home in Europe, but there wasn't much condemnation. And Aliyev essentially sensed that he had a carte blanche to press deeper, and that's what he did. His next move was to set up a blockade at the one and only land connection between Armenia and what remained of Artsakh. So the lifeline that the Armenians in Artsakh had to Armenia is known as the Lachin Corridor. And preserving this connection was part of the agreement of the Russian brokered peace deal that ended the 2020 war. So this blockade was initially presented to be some sort of spontaneous Azeri civilian protest. But when Aliyev realized that internationally nobody truly cares, all pretenses were dropped, and it was revealed to be an illegal military blockade all along. But again, Russian peacekeepers hadn't the will or the capacity to stop this from happening. And we call it a blockade of the road, but in reality it's also of the airspace. And indeed it was accompanied by attacks on the energy, the gas coming in to Artsakh. And clearly it was a campaign to terrorize the people there and compel them to leave. So at this point, Moreno Campo had seen enough. He is the founding prosecutor of the International Criminal Court. And here's this quote that he has. And his use of the G word was somewhat picked up. Some analysts and reporters were still being told the Azeri lies on this point, which is that Azerbaijan would take care of the Armenians there. But anyone who would press deeper would see that their true intention was pretty obvious. So this went on for months. And finally, once Aliyev saw that there was minimal condemnation from the international community, but also sensing that the Armenians there simply won't leave, despite the rampant death and disease stemming directly from this blockade, he decided to invade with drones, unmanned aerial vehicles, bombing the civilian regions, straight out of the 2020 playbook. He cut off communications. There were no international observers there anyway on account of the blockade. And within a few days, the men and women who realized the Russians will not defend them, so they took up arms, within a matter of perhaps a day or two, immediately surrendered. So in the days that followed, we started seeing rampant reports of Azeri soldiers, moving in, killing civilians at random, raping women, bombing children, and so on. I'm not going to go into the actual details of some of the actions that were done. I'll just point out that despite Azeri attempts to target the witnesses and their effort to cut off the communication to prevent evidence sharing, there are verified images coming out, there are first-hand accounts, and there's definitely bodies. So hopefully the media picks up on some of this, but as of today, none of what we're seeing on X and Telegram are being picked up. And these are some very grisly things coming out, and it's essentially the definition of ethnic cleansing and genocide, and this type of cruelty will continue for a significant amount of time. And it's essentially like a train that can't be stopped at this point. At the time of filming this, we've already gotten this mass exodus of Armenians. About 50,000 have made it out already, and it's expected that all of them will come out, except for, say, a fringe few that might try to remain within the churches and whatnot. And from these people that have come out, we're coming to know how promptly the Azeris are already destroying any trace of the Armenians that have lived there for centuries. So there's this clip of this guy, some Azeri foreign diplomat or whatever, who tries to pretend that they're not going to inflict such cruelty on the Armenians there. And you could just listen to his broken logic on how there is no need for international observers, and yet there is nothing to hide. We know that the Armenians there will be stripped of their homes. We know that the men, the husbands and sons, will be killed in some sort of retribution for having defended themselves so far, even if they are elderly and clearly did not defend themselves. These intentions have been made clear in statements by officials in Aliyev's dictatorship. This is what makes it the literal definition of ethnic cleansing and genocide. We're seeing something else that's really curious in the media that's picking up this story, and because they default to picking up the Aliyev influenced wire that may report that, you've got these Armenians that are choosing to leave, and that framing in itself is really problematic because they're not choosing to leave. They have no choice. The alternative is to die. It's like saying they're choosing to breathe, right? There's ample evidence of what Aliyev's army will do to Armenians when nobody's watching. They call it They call the Armenians there separatists or rebels in the breakaway region, right? But the right word is, these are indigenous persons living in their native land, the same land they've lived in for more than 3,000 years, and they have a right to self-determination, which is being undermined. It's mystifying, really, for me and for anybody who is watching this, that in the year 2023, the world will stand idly by as the corrupt and evil dictator of Azerbaijan commits a genocide. They call it reintegration or reclamation of this land, but we've already seen how the Azeri state desecrates any Armenian cultural heritage, churches, fortresses, etc. They do this on Telegram. They do it on even state Instagram channels. They reimagine Armenian sites as though they were not put there by Armenians, but rather some other Christian group that came and went centuries ago. So I posit to you that the Western media has not brought this issue to you because Armenia is an ex-Soviet country, and despite its independence in 1991, despite its ties to the West and Europe, it's still in the sphere of influence of Moscow. And thus advocating for Armenians or Armenia is kind of distracting from all that's going on in Ukraine. It's an unnecessary side plot, and there aren't that many Armenians anyway. So now we have this visit in Armenia by Samantha Power, who's in charge of USAID, and she's talked about how there will be some aid for the Armenians that come out of Artsakh. And it's truly hypocritical because we all know about the literal millions in aid that the United States grants to Azerbaijan each year for their military. Azerbaijan, which is a key and important ally of Russia, and also a reseller of Russian gas. And then you have Canada. The conservative opposition in Canada calls out what's going on and calls for immediate action and sanctions. The NDP, the third rank party here, calls for sanctions. Even the Bloc Québécois, which is our single issue French-Canadian party, calls this out, and quite eloquently actually. But the liberals who are in power, the liberals who dedicate literal billions in aid to Ukraine and espouse the values of never again and preventing dictatorships such as Russia from taking land and so on, they can't even get out of their own way when it comes to Armenia. The Liberal Party was in charge when there were Canadian exports of drone parts to Turkey that ended up in Azerbaijan, and the Canadian government has not remedied this, not at all. And they still continue to find themselves unable to condemn it, and they find themselves unable to sanction Azerbaijan. They speak about these sanctions as though it might be too harsh or too soon, and all this despite Bob Rae, the UN ambassador to Canada, saying, here's his quote, that we have to do everything we can to try to protect the civilian population of Artsakh. And yet what they say and what they do seems to have no connection. Okay, so it's time for my take on these things. None of the background I've given so far is novel or anything, but here's my 3 points that I'd like to bring out. Number one is that all of this is Aliyev, it's not Azerbaijan. Number two is that this can and should be reversed. And number three is that it's safe and very important to have an opinion about this matter. So number one was that despite Aliyev's effort to indoctrinate racism towards Armenians into the Azeri populace, and I talk about this in another video, many of the people of Azerbaijan still became educated anyway, and they denounced that view. Azerbaijan is a dictatorship with some of the lowest media freedom scores in the world, and yet they form an opinion that is very different from Aliyev's. So here are 5 heroes. Amnesty International identified them. These are 5 individuals who, for me, I rank them right up there with all of the Armenians that gave their lives to hold on to their children and family and property. All 5 of these people were immediately detained for speaking out, for opposing this aggression internally. And it's not as though Aliyev's cruelty is limited to Armenians. He has countless domestic failings. He has severely restricted the freedoms of his citizens and has concentrated all of the oil wealth of the Caspian within a very tight elite few. Geographically and in terms of natural resources, Azerbaijan is so blessed and well equipped to be a powerhouse nation. The demographics, the sea shipping routes, all of the oil, of course. This country should have been far further ahead, but Ilham Aliyev has used all of the nation's wealth to benefit only himself and his grudge against Armenians, and he has rested his political future on crushing Armenians and latching on to Turkey. If he succeeds, it may well secure his dictatorship for another decade, maybe more, maybe less. But it is clear that eventually his rule will crumble. History will not look back favorably upon him. His country is very poorly set up for a future condition where oil is a second or third tier role in the global energy market. And we've seen dictatorships like his fall, and the whole military campaign against Armenians is largely a distraction of his domestic failings. Over and over again, Aliyev has laid claims to every corner of the tiny Armenia that remains, nestled between Azerbaijan and Turkey. Over and over again, he's spoken of Armenians as an inferior people. So I highlight this because I want people listening to this to realize that while peace appears so unattainable, I really believe that the thirst for destruction of Armenians is really only there because of the present administration putting it there. And this presents a challenge now for people like me and for people that might want to call it out, because the natural reaction here is we want to bring this cruelty to light. We will try to accumulate evidence and try and get people tried in court. And for the average Azerbaijani, that might seem like an Armenian that has ill will towards him or towards her, only further entrenching the distrust between Armenians and Azeris. That's not the intention. I mean, it's a very natural reaction for Armenians or any advocate for this conflict to end to try to convince Formula One to cancel their race in Baku, or to compel a band like Imagine Dragons to not have their concert in Baku. They're not doing this because we're trying to rob the local people of such a great experience, or the local economy of the benefit of having a Formula One race. The target of this is the crime that must be remedied, but the result winds up being a repeating cycle of distrust and bitter adversarial relationship, and that's the dilemma here. And the best I've ever been able to come up with is to be super specific over and over again that it's purely the present administration that we take exception to, not Azerbaijani people. My second point was the following. So geopolitically, it doesn't look good for Armenians. Armenians have long found themselves at a crossroads between Russian influence and Western influence. So in 2018, within Armenia, what appeared to be a wise anti-corruption regime change actually created a vulnerability, and the Russian motivation to preserve its role in Armenia fell away, and yet the West would not assist, and Armenians clearly still had ties to the Russian economy, the very economy that the West was seeking to harm in its strategy to sanction Russia to ending its war in Ukraine. And now here we are, Russia is compelled to punish the Armenian leadership to prompt them to reject Westernism. And at the same time, winter approaches in Europe, so Europe may not be keen to risk unsettling its new energy partner. And the US continues to be indifferent on the matter, as Azerbaijan's role in containing Iran is also relevant for them as well. So with all this backdrop, why do I say that this situation can be remedied? Because any of those three parties could score a huge victory for regional leadership and strength by doing that action. If either the US or Europe could compel an evil dictator to stick to the rules-based order, international rules-based order, despite their own competing energy interest, it would demonstrate something to Russia. It would demonstrate something to Armenians too, of course, but certainly also to the entire peanut gallery of autocrats waiting to crush their own neighbors, that, you know, Europe or the US or Canada has the will and the ability to keep autocrats in line. Alternately, Russia could do the very same. It can demonstrate to Armenia and to the West that it is the only one true ally of Armenia, and it still does have the regional influence. Weakened as it may be, it's still certainly intact. And I don't think it would backfire for the West or for Russia to do this, because Aliyev cannot justify internally to turn away from Europe or from Russia. Aliyev has always tested the water before doing anything. We know how he speaks of making economic claims for reparations from Armenia. We know how he speaks of the Armenian capital, Yerevan, as somehow also fit for capture by Azerbaijan. And we know how immediately he intends to attack the southern provinces of Armenia proper to eliminate Armenia's border with Iran and directly connect it to Turkey. We have to ask ourselves, is it really up to Armenians alone to put this tyrant in his place? So these parties must demand a reversal of what's gone on. Demand removal of Azerbaijani militants from Artsakh. Armenians must be assured safe return to their homes and a safe connection to their Armenian homeland. These parties must show the world that fringe states cannot just conduct land grabs and alterations of their borders in 2023. What an achievement that would be in Western diplomacy or Russian diplomacy, or better still, if it was somehow coordinated, sometimes competing forces still doing what's right in one specific place where an autocrat has to be brought back in line. And my third point was that it's important for everyday people like you and me to have an opinion and to speak out. The main reason is because it actually makes a huge difference. Again, the link between public outcry and whether horrors take place or not is the theme here. Every time Aliyev gets away with anything, he proceeds with worse and worse. How many other social justice ideals have you stood up for online or in your discourse with friends and possibly even a politician, and the results are there? I mean, public opinion is why so much progress has been made in other aspects of our society. So this is just one more matter that competes for your empathy and your attention. And the second reason is because, remember, you can always change your opinion. That notion is the very essence of this channel. I am HCO, in my humble changing opinion. I think we're very fortunate that we can forge opinions that need not define our whole personality, and we can take action on those opinions knowing full well that down the road it may be an opinion that endures or evolves. And that's something beautiful and it's part of our growth, and growing is living. I think everyone who becomes familiar with this matter should decide. Should these people die? Should they have to starve? Should they lose all they have and suffer at the hands of a tyrant as their culture and their identity is erased? Is it okay for leaders of countries to grab land? Should indigenous populations have the right for self-determination? Should it be just no big deal that over 3,000 years of cultural value can be desecrated? And when someone like Aliyev inherits power of a country from his father, holds onto it for decades, installs racism and hatred in his people, and rewards unspeakable cruelty, all while undermining his own country's social and economic growth, will we still acknowledge him as some sort of a legitimate leader? Please watch this conflict closely. Just consuming the news and the media around it is something very important. Advocating for what's right to politicians is not something I expect most people to do, but consider elevating it to the same level of concern you might have for some of the other social justice matters. It might make a world of difference.